Hi students, today I'll be discussing V.O. Key's article, The Lack of a Budgetary Theory, published in 1940. This article is probably one of my favorite articles in public administration. The reason is because it answered a question that no one prior to this person, the author V.O. Key writing, had ever discussed or thought about before. So this article was published in 1940. I first read this article actually when I was a PhD student at Rutgers. And I'm giving it to you because I think master's students need to read this article too, as well as PhD students. The reason I am one of my favorite articles is because V.O. Key brought up a point that no one had thought about before, which was simply, how does a budget get decided? What is the reason behind it? What is the public policies behind it? And he came up with the idea, of course, on what basis do you spend money on activity X versus Y. So of course, 1940 was about 50, 60 years after the field of public administration had just come about from the Pendleton Act of 1887, after the assassination of James Garfield by a disgruntled job seeker. Most students know the story by now, and that's how it came about. And so Key said what Key said and what Key brought up in his article, that most of American budgetary literature is focused on procedure rather than substance, meaning there really isn't anything there. You're just going through the mechanics of something. You need to look at it more closely. Hence the reason, why are you allocating money to X versus Y? What is the reason for that? Most scholarship and practice address the mechanics, the forms, the procedures, or the structures of budgeting, but they neglect the underlying question. How and why are finite public resources allocated to specific objectives? Now, the central problem, of course, is budget officials have to always allocate scarce resources among all these different alternative uses, right? Department A, B, C, D, E, F, G, Y of, let's say, the government or state, not state, let's say the city government of Houston. And you have all these different departments, Houston Police Department, Houston Fire Department, Public City Works, that's XYZ, all these other ones out there, social services, homeless, there's so many out there, right? How can it be possible that you can allocate, you get $1 billion a year as, let's say, your you get that as your budget. I believe the city of Houston budget is $2 billion a year, out of which 60% of that goes to the Houston Police Department, which is a big chunk. That means about $1.2 billion goes to the Houston Police Department, which is very large. So how do you allocate that? How does that make sense, right? What is the reason for that? And so what he said was, economic theorists, they frame the resource allocation, meaning how much people get or different departments get, as maximizing utility among competing ends. Budget makers rarely apply such frameworks, basically. They should apply, actually. There's actually very little attention to measuring and comparing the relative aspects, the social value utility of different government activities, as to why the Houston Fire Department and the Houston Police Department, which have different budgets, how are they the same or how are they different, and what roles do they play, and is one role more important than the other? Clearly, if the Houston Police Department is getting $1.2 billion as their budget, that's a big chunk of money. They must be more important. But why? What is the policy reason behind that? Is there a policy reason behind that? Now, of course, V.O. Key, of course, any academic does this. I'm giving you a secret about this if you're watching my video. Is that every academic, if they want to make a name for themselves, they have to attack the prior theories before them, the prior literature before them, basically. Because they have to say, look, that's all great. You did a great job out there. But let me tell you something that you've done wrong. Interesting enough, of course, for those of you who maybe become lawyers someday, that is exactly what lawyers do when they look at judges' opinions. And they'll say, well, we think the judge was right over here, but they were wrong over here, Your Honor. And that's where we're making the appeal. So professions are like that. At medical school, for those who go to medical school and doctors, as my father was a medical university professor, it's the same exact thing. One doctor tells you, I think this is cancer. You're going to say, I want a second opinion. Let me go find somebody else who's going to disagree with you. And it looks like it might not be cancer, but maybe it is cancer. You might have a hard choice there. But any profession, they try to one-up each other. Unfortunately, it is like that. It's like that in academia, too, by the way. Studies, of course, public budgeting, they emphasize a lot of classification, aggregate spending. They do procedural standards, as I mentioned before. But public finance scholarship and economic literature focus more on revenue generation rather than the allocation of funds. Let me repeat that, because that's something that the VOK really noticed, and other people after him were like, yeah, we should have seen that coming, we didn't think about that. That's why this article, even though it's almost 100 years old, it's still so well used. Is the VOK said, that's great, you have all this money coming in, the resource, you're bringing in so much money, but the problem with you is you don't know how to allocate those funds correctly to have a maximized utility benefit for everybody. You're not doing that properly, which is very true. Another good example I can give you is, as everyone knows, in Washington, D.C. right now, we have a lot of fights going on, political infighting. The federal government budget, like most state budgets, which they copied off the federal budget, of course, is a 2-year cycle. Every 2 years, they put the budget together. It's supposed to be that way. Unfortunately, in the past 15 or 20 years, because of all the political infighting, the polarization, the viciousness, that's why every few months you hear on the news, the government's going to get shut down. The government's going to get shut down. Yeah, because you guys have not done the 2-year cycle. You just kick the can down the road for a little bit. Then we have to come in and, the legislators, the congressmen, the senators have to beg to try to get everything together. So what VOQ was arguing was, and of course in 1940, luckily this wasn't going on, but VOQ was arguing that the problem is the money is coming in to the treasury, the state, government or the city government, but you're not allocating it properly. You need to figure out a way to allocate it properly, which goes back to the root of his question in the beginning. On what basis should activity X get more than activity Y? What is the reason? How do you determine that? Which is why, for those of you who take my course in PAD 620, and I can make a plug for my 620 public policy course, for those who take my course, we talk about this article also, because the budget is also used as a tool of policy making. Because of course, if a legislator does not like a certain department, or they don't like a certain organization, they may try to punish them if they're a powerful legislator. Like, for example, the governor. They could put a veto. I'm not going to sign off on this. I don't want to have money spent towards Houston Fire Department or the Houston Police Department. I want to cut their budget. So that's where politicians can be very powerful about that. And the bureaucrats have to work with them. And for those who will get into more and more, if you take my PAD 500 class, we talk about that with the cozy iron triangle theory, which has been around for probably another 100 years also. Now, of course, like the Constitution mentions, and I'm sure students have heard this over the years, special interest groups. They come in and they'll argue and they'll say, I want this, I want that, you have to give this to me. And there'll be a lot of, politicking that goes on, a lot of negotiation, late into the night. And some people will get what they want, some political groups will not get what they want. Honestly telling you, no one is ever going to be happy at the end of the day. Because some political groups will think, well, I didn't get everything, I got something, but I should have got more. How come that organization got more than I did? It doesn't end, actually, because it's finite resources. So everybody's not going to be happy. But that's the way the cookie crumbles. Now, of course, there are implications for some of you who are practicing, and some of you work in budgeting, or you're running your own small business, things like that, for example. You have to think about that. What is my budget? What do I have to spend money on? A good example, of course, is a birthday party budget, or vacation trip budget, or Christmas budget. There's always going to be budgets you have to put together. So, of course, there's political bargaining that drives the allocation process I mentioned. Budgetary agencies, they favor accountants and technicians. But Key, of course, argues that you should have more economist political philosophers to address the underlying allocation dilemmas. Basically, what Key was talking about was we need a balance, okay? You need to have some balance. You got to have some political philosophers, economic people, you got to have some accountants, the bean counters, and you have some technicians or technocrats, basically. You have to have a little bit of everybody. You have to make it a diverse pie. Decisions are made incrementally and often unconsciously. That's something you should also consider, reflecting political pressures rather than systematic evaluation of public interest. So decisions are made very incrementally in government, slow moving, slow talking. We'll allocate 5% this year, $1 billion this year, and next year we're going to put a very reasonable and slow incremental 5% or 3%, something small like that. So your budget has grown because you have to take into account that there's inflation, so things have gone up in price. So we'll give you a little extra, but it's a small amount, just to kind of cover you basically. How much of a difference that makes, probably not much. Of course, last couple of things that I want to discuss. Key's big thing, and why I use this article for budgeting classes, and I use it at the PhD level when I teach PhD classes, is that budgeting is a really big deal. It's a policy process. Whoever controls the purse, the money, they control all the policies, actually, which is what we're seeing in DC, and we're seeing that in Austin also. If a governor doesn't like somebody or doesn't like a certain organization or a department, they're not happy with them for whatever reason, they can cut their funding. They can harm them in many ways. Same thing with the president. The president doesn't like the Department of Education, or doesn't like the Department of Energy, or doesn't like somebody else, or some other organization. Well, I'm going to cut it now. I'm going to cut this over here, because I don't think you should be spending money on that. And that's why budgeting is such a policy tool. That's why probably at the heart of all public administration, all the public administration decisions that you see in the news every day, or you hear about, all of it leads back to money. All of it leads back to the budget. So the next time you hear something on the news regarding, money, Ukraine or something else, some other war in a far-flung country, you got to go back to the budget. What is the budget the United States is spending on defense or on outside helping our allies or enemies? Why did homelessness go up this year? Back to the budget. So that's why this article is seminal. Seminal meaning it's the cornerstone of all the articles that were written after that. So I highly encourage students. In fact, the last thing I would like to say to students is, for those of you considering doing a capstone paper or a master's thesis of some type, budgeting would be a great topic actually. And it doesn't have to be very, math-like. I know that's something that people kind of get scared by, but it doesn't have to be. It can be more theoretical actually. Well, thank you again, and I'm glad that I was able to spend time with you. And I look forward to seeing you at the next lecture.